In our gospel lesson, Jesus continues what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. With words that are familiar to us, we always try to listen with fresh ears so that we can gain new insights. We are helped also in the decorations today because our scripture speaks, Jesus' sermon illustration speaks of being salt and light in the world. We're thankful to Carol Quintano and a number of her helpers who helped to set up a display here to help to enhance our worship. The second thing was something that I've known about but always wondered about is why there are big blocks of salt out in the pasture. And I saw it recently at Fleet Farm, and I thought to ask. And they said, well, because the diet of the dairy cows may be deficient in salt, and that both sodium and chloride are necessary for milk production. And so the idea of having salt out in the fields, of being salt in the world, is very important to us here in Wisconsin. Yeah. So I learned something every sermon. That's good. Listen for Jesus' words speaking to us. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. The city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Friends, this is the gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I also want to note that besides learning about salt licks, I'm learning many things. I continue to learn things about being here in Wisconsin, and in our never-ending quest to learn all things Wisconsin, Henri and I were, on Friday, we were in Racine. And while we were in Racine, some people there said to us, well, you have to go get a Kringle. Which, of course, begs the question, what's a Kringle? So we went to O&H Bakery, and we found out what a Kringle is. And it is a major yummy. And so we brought one back, and we are not having it put out until after this service, and so that the people who did make an effort to come will have first dibs on a Kringle that we have cut up for you. So enjoy. Salt and light in the world. It's something that I've thought about a long time, because my preaching career actually began when I was just barely in high school. You see, in our small Presbyterian congregation in Charlotte, North Carolina, our youth leader and youth decided that we were going to have a youth worship service. And so we talked the pastor into us having a youth-led service at the church. And since I had spent so much time playing with musical groups, playing Christian music, and working with what were called campus life clubs, and hanging out with those at the big big Southern Baptist youth group around the corner, it seemed like I was the one who had the lingo and also the nerve to write a sermon and get up and preach it. And so I did. It was, as I recall, much too long, no comments, and much too much like a speech than a sermon, again, no comments. And it was filled with some rather judgmental and immature theology, maybe because I'd been hanging out with all my Southern Baptist friends who somehow inferred that if you weren't Southern Baptist, you might not be Christian. But wonderful, wonderful people. Well, despite the deficiencies of my first sermon, the people of my church were so incredibly gracious in their appreciation that I, as a young person, had, first of all, the nerve to get up and preach, and none of them critiqued the content of that sermon, which when I look back at that sermon text years later, I cringe, and I realize what a wonderfully loving act it was that they didn't critique it to my face. And I once asked my youth leader years later how they tolerated my fervent but immature and judgmental sermon. And he said this to me, "Oh, I don't know that they would even remember the content, Tom. They were listening to the witness. You were telling them that Christ had personally impacted your life in a special way, and that you knew now that a Christian has a unique responsibility to love God and to share Christ's work." And he continued, this was our youth leader, Henry Bigham. Henry continued, "That's all the sermon you will ever preach, if indeed what you do is really preaching." That has always stayed with me. And he concluded, he said, "And that's all any Christian is called to be, in whatever it is they do, to witness to the reality of God in their lives." Years later, as I was reading seminary texts like the Systematic Theology of Karl Barth, I do remember Barth wrote this: "The only advantage of the church over against the world is that the church knows the real situation in the world. Christians know what non-Christians do not. It belongs to the church to witness to the dominion of Christ clearly, explicitly, and consciously." And Jesus, this is why he gets to be the Messiah, he said the same thing, not in my sermon length or in Karl Barth's length, but in Jesus' length. Because Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." And when he said that, the Sermon on the Mount, I know we have this image, this bucolic image of all these people intently listening to every word of Jesus. I imagine his disciples were totally stunned and speechless and confused. Why? Because of the emphatic and the abrupt change of what Jesus had just said. Think about this. Remember this. In the Sermon on the Mount, throughout the entire Beatitudes, all the blesseds are, Jesus keeps describing in third person, them. Blessed are they, the poor in spirit. And of course the disciples would come to learn what they meant, but at that time they thought Jesus was talking to them, the others. Blessed are they, those who mourn, those who are the meek, those who are the hungry and thirsting for righteousness, the merciful, them the pure in heart, them the peacemakers, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And then suddenly he says, "Blessed are you is getting personal. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And this was so new and startling for them. You see, these disciples thought they could follow Jesus anywhere, and they could hear him making broad claims for his followers and the future imperative, because that's what it was saying. They will do this, they will do that. The Gospel of Matthew is chock full of such commands, such imperatives, such expectations for action. But suddenly Jesus says, you. It would have made all the sense in the world for Jesus to say, I am the salt of the earth, or I am the light of the world. But he didn't. He said, you. This ragtag bunch of fishermen, tax collectors, low-ranking common folk in an impoverished district in a conquered nation. And Jesus is saying that they are going to be the focal point to preserve salt and to enlighten light the whole of humanity. Yeah, right, Jesus. But as any reader of the Gospel of Matthew already knows and witnesses in retelling this gospel story, that is exactly what happened, isn't it? They were the salt of the earth. They were the light of the world when he said, you. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a sophisticated goals by objectives ministry plan, does it? 2 sentences. You are this and you are that, salt and light. If that was the way that we organized business, the way we organize civic functions, I was going to say the way we organize government, but I'm going to leave that to the side. It would probably fail. And yet it is still the plan for the Church of Jesus Christ to witness to the reality of God in our lives. Why should we expect it to work for the church when it wouldn't work for business or for civic groups or sometimes for government? Because Jesus said it's not the plan for a product or an agenda that's yet to become. It's not something off in the future. Instead, it's a witness to the God who is and a statement of the church that we are. So living our faith in the Spirit of Christ and being willing to acknowledge Christ of the Gospels as the central guide for our living in the real world, that's the plan. And it's among the hardest things and the most wonderful things we will ever know. You know, sometimes we hearken back to certain days of bygone days of 50 or 60 years ago when churches seemed to be full and budgets were overflowing, and we think of that as maybe the heyday of the church. Everything seemed okay and good, but we also know from reflective history and theology and from our readings that there was a lot of darkness in our society and world that received very little light. There was so much blandness that we overlooked when it truly needed spice. The spiritual faith that Jesus Christ established among that tiny band 2,000 years ago was never intended to be light from the culture, whether it was Constantine's empire or modern America. Because when that happens, the salt and the light of Christ become an easy path, a hollow witness. And even if it looks like successful religion, it can become the decline or the denial or even the death of faithfulness. So we need to take the salt and light seriously. What is it that determines the vibrancy then of a community of faith, of a church? I believe that it depends on one factor alone, the vibrancy of a church. That is, people understand that these words of Jesus Christ are speaking to them personally and spiritually in the present life, the present day. And that we embrace that calling, whatever that witness might come to require from us, whatever it requires. I mean, think about it. If the God who created the entire cosmos and all the people of this world is touching your life personally, and through you offers to change the world, whether in small ways or grand ways, it will require significant dedication and effort from you to serve God in that way. And so how blasé can you be about God's offer? And it doesn't mean that you have to become some super isolated Christian paragon of piety and virtue. You don't have to be threatened by the way other people believe. And you need to be tolerant of those who may not believe and act as you do. But it does mean that in your own self-faith image and your view of God's creation, in your conduct of your personal ethics and daily life and what you contribute to church and society, your faith and knowledge of God should always be a present guide and an unashamed witness. It also means that we need to remember those who are beyond us gathering on Sunday morning, whether it's people who have never heard of the gospel message of love and light and salt, or even some of our church members who, for whatever reason, have drifted away from being part of the fellowship of our church. We need to be active. We need to invite. We need to love. We need to realize what we have been offered to give to others and to do so joyfully. We have a lot of light even when it doesn't seem like a lot of light. It was amazing as we put up the display this week, and I realized that we have light all over the place. And yet, what is it that draws our attention? It's the light that is here. It is the salt that is gathered. I remember reading about a group of people who went to Mammoth Cave. Have any of you ever been to Mammoth Cave? Yeah, it's Mammoth, right? And in Mammoth Cave, when people were there, they were told to steady themselves because they were going to turn all the lights off. And when they turned the lights off, it was going to be disorienting for some. So the lights were turned off, and it was absolute and total darkness, a deep darkness that many of them had never experienced before. And it was disorienting. And it was, for many, it was frightening. And so the guide then took and lit a single match to a candle. And in that sheer darkness, that flame looked so bright. It looked so bright, it was almost offending. And then as people looked away, they realized that the light from that single candle, that single flame, was now, it was etching out the surroundings, and it was bringing out details they had never seen before, and it was making that cave into something which was just amazing to them. Their eyes were opened, wide opened, as they looked at what that one flame could show them. I used to be among a lot of Quakers in eastern Pennsylvania, and I remember they did have a saying. It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And that also brings to mind one of my favorite Peanuts cartoons, because I think some of our best theology comes from Charles Schulz and Peanuts. And in this cartoon, Linus is always very reflective, and he quotes that saying to Charlie Brown on a deep, dark night. And then in the next panel, it shows Lucy standing alone out in the field, looking up into the night sky and yelling, "Stupid darkness!" It's better to light the candle. Jesus has said before us and to us, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. That is not an easy statement to say or to embrace. But for those who know the spiritual reality of Jesus Christ, It is the heart of all the preaching that we will ever need to hear or to say. So friends, let's have the courage and joy to choose to be salty Christians and illuminating people of faith as we rejoice, as we learn together, as we walk our daily paths, as we do ministry, and as we nurture an ever-deepening awareness of God in our world. Let us be in prayer. Holy God, we are so thankful and moved and challenged, and yes, in the darkness of this world, sometimes frightened, to realize that you have called us to light a candle in the darkness, to be salt and spice when everyone wants to make things bland or to pretend that there are not needs around us. Your calling is a couple of sentences that seem so simple, and yet they will rock our lives and they will change this world. And for that, we thank you. Amen.